Well, a very good evening, everybody. On behalf of event partners Reconciliation SA, Gladys Elphick Awards Committee and the History Trust of South Australia, welcome to the 2023 Gladys Elphick Oration. My name's Greg Mackey, and in my capacity as Chief Executive with the History Trust of South Australia, it's my privilege to be your host this evening. Before proceeding, on our collective behalf, I acknowledge we're meeting here on the traditional country of the Kaurna people, always was, always will be, Kaurna land. It's my great pleasure to introduce Kaurna Narungga Narrandjeri and Arrernte man Anthony Wilson. Anthony is a cultural educator and entrepreneur with Kumakaru Cultural Services. And Anthony, I'd be delighted if you would come and provide a welcome to country. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me? Yes. Perfect. Amazing. I don't like using microphones, so it's a lot easier for me. So firstly, Nainari Nyankumina, Nainari Anthony Watapara Wilson, Nainari Ghani Milford, Ghani Tangi Wandi, Madlia Muranga, Ghani Tanga Ghani Yaka. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. My name is Anthony Wilson. I go by the totemic name Watapara of Steel here in Ghana country. And it's a pleasure to be able to welcome you to the country on behalf of my community and on behalf of my ancestors. It's even a bigger pleasure to be able to do that in language. For a long time, language wasn't able to be spoken publicly. So now, for me, to be able to do that, and to be able to pass that on to my children, my nieces and nephews, and so on and so forth, is an amazing thing. It shows how far we, as a country, have come to be able to achieve that. And as society here in South Australia, it's amazing to be able to see the politicians that may get up here tonight and after us, to be able to do acknowledgement of countries in language is amazing to be able to do that. So it's a very special week, obviously NAIDOC week, to be able to talk about our elders being the theme. Obviously it's amazing to be here for the Gladys Elphick Oration. You know, we've had so many pioneers for Aboriginal people within our community, and especially Aboriginal women, elder women as well. We could go on, and obviously we're sitting over here with a few aunties talking about some of our connections to family and country. But at the end of all that, I want to thank you for being here tonight, and I hope all of those of you who are here tonight have a great night, enjoy it, and make sure that you stay safe here in Ghana country. So thank you very much, enjoy your evening, and I'll see you all soon.
Thank you, Anthony, for that very lovely, warm welcome. Now, all of us here are special. After all, it's a Tuesday evening in the cold of winter, and we've braved it, and it's just after 7 p.m. But I do wish to formally acknowledge a few people who are extra special at this point. First and foremost, a really special and warm welcome to our guest speaker for this evening, the Honourable Kyam, Maher, MLC, South Australia's Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, Attorney General and Minister for Industrial Relations and the Public Service. Welcome also to Commissioner for Children and Young People and Co-Chair of Reconciliation, Helen Connolly, also CEO of Reconciliation SA, Jason Downs, and Reconciliation SA board members. Welcome also to former SA Attorney General, the Honourable Chris Sumner AM. I'm also delighted to acknowledge our Chair of Trustees at the History Trust, Elizabeth Ho, OAM, fellow trustees, history guardians, and my senior colleagues with the History Trust of South Australia. I'd also extend a very warm welcome to Gladys Elphick Awards Committee Chair Lenore Banyara and her fellow committee members. A special shout out in absentia also to History Trust trustee Dr. Jared Thomas, who was yesterday named as NAIDOC Person of the Year. So here we are, the second Gladys Elphick Oration convened by the History Trust and our partners, and it is especially fitting that we present this event during NAIDOC Week 2023 with its overarching theme, For Our Elders. Gladys Elphick, MBE, or Auntie Glad as she was known to so many, was and remains a greatly respected elder and past elder. I know that in Minister Maher's address, he will include reference to Gladys Elphick's achievements and legacy, and so therefore remains for me to note simply that the History Trust and our partners Reconciliation SA and the Gladys Elphick Awards Committee are really privileged that her family agreed to our naming this oration in her honour back in 2021. And for those of you who may know less about Gladys Elphick's legacy, I hope that following Minister Maher's address, your appreciation for why this wonderful woman remains so warmly remembered by so many will be deepened. So, to the matter of this evening's oration. In this, the year of both a national referendum and South Australia's Parliament being the first to legislate a First Nations voice, there is one South Australian who is at the very centre of progress, and that is the Honourable Kyam Maher, MLC. To introduce Minister Maher, it's my great delight to invite event partner Reconciliation SA co-chair Helen Connolly to the lectern. As well as being South Australia's Commissioner for Children and Young People, Helen has served with passion and commitment as co-chair of Reconciliation SA for nearly 8 years. Please join me in welcoming Commissioner Helen Connolly.
I always struggle when people talk about time frames, and I think 8 years, wow, it doesn't feel that long. It must be time to hang up the shingle or something. Anyway, thank you, Greg, for your introduction. I also want to thank Anthony for his welcome, his gracious welcome. And it's always great to hear language, as you say, and for always having that little bit of cultural education that goes along with the welcome, so thank you. I also want to obviously acknowledge that we're gathered here on Kaurna lands and pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and acknowledge this year's NAIDOC theme is for our elders. So it's great, it provides the opportunity, I guess, to reflect and celebrate elders both past and present, and to really kind of think through. I think for anyone who was at the NAIDOC Awards yesterday saw a bit of a trailer of a film where elders talked about what it meant to be an elder. And I think it was so important to hear things like how much they were knowledge holders, trailblazers, nurturers, advocates, teachers, survivors, leaders, hard workers, and loved by so many. So thank you to all of the elders who have tirelessly paved the way for all of us. And particularly for women like Auntie Gladys, who really have embodied, I guess, the strength and the warmth and the resilience, and always grounded in culture and truth and survival. And so tonight's oration, in honour of everything Auntie Gladys fought hard for, I'm hoping that at the end of this, after the Minister has given us his insights, that we can also continue the important conversations that must follow in the next month or so as we all prepare for the referendum this year. I really want to thank you for showing up and supporting the journey of reconciliation in our state and our nation. As the co-chair of Reconciliation SA, I encourage you all to be active listeners and participants in the next chapter of both our state and in the ongoing journey of creating a better place for all of us. I think it was yesterday the Premier was rousing in his remarks about it's not now is the time to challenge, now is the time to wear your colours on your sleeve and to really start thinking about what it is in the future of Australia. It's a real privilege to be a partner in this oration. We are Reconciliation SA is a not-for-profit, member-based organisation with a real focus on education, awareness and developing respectful relationships. Tonight is also an opportunity to hear from the Minister about his views on our state, our history, and what it means, what he's been doing personally to create a greater place for us all to live. So it is a time for us to be able to show our support to First Nations people and to support their role, the role of voice in a reconciled Australia and a greater future. So it's my privilege to be able to introduce our keynote speaker for tonight, the Honourable Minister Kyam Maher. He's going to be talking on South Australia's democratic leadership, the voice in history. So Minister Maher is the Minister, as Greg said, for Aboriginal Affairs, Attorney General, Minister for Industrial Relations and the Public Sector, and the Leader of Government Business in the Ledge Council. Still, yeah. All right, he's a proud, just checking, nothing's happened in the last little while. He's a proud Aboriginal man who has served as the Aboriginal Affairs Minister in both the Wetherill and Malinauskas Labor governments, guiding important reforms which he will talk through, to being the first state in Australia to commence treaty negotiations with Aboriginal nations and implementing a Stolen Generations reparations scheme. Kyam is particularly passionate about ensuring that all South Australians are afforded the dignity that good, meaningful jobs provide, and that all South Australians can share in the opportunities and benefits of this state. As a graduate of Adelaide University, he holds degrees in law and economics and practiced as a lawyer with the Crown Solicitor's Office before working in politics. After growing up in country South Australia, mainly Mount Gambier, and I note your dad's in the room, so g'day Jim. Kyam now lives in the southern suburbs of Adelaide with his wife Carmel, 3 sons and a cat, and a growing flock of chooks. There you go. He might want to come back and do a lecture on chook rearing, who knows. So Kyam, it says here, enjoys spending time in regional South Australia, cycling, albeit slower than perhaps previous years, mowing the lawn, and has a particular fondness for a good sausage roll, of which we've both complained tonight that the sausage roll was vegan. There was no sausage in the sausage roll. So I'm sure we can do a critique on that. And he's about to embark on a couple of weeks' well-earned rest on holiday with the family. But before he does that, he has one thing he needs to do for us, and that's to present this evening's lecture. So thank you and welcome, Minister.
Thank you, Commissioner, but just be reminded that at some stage I might be introducing you at such a forum, so I'll see if I can make that happen. Thank you, Anthony, for your very generous welcome to your ancestors' country. Where we are today, wherever we are across this nation, wherever you go to sleep, wherever you wake up, it's on Aboriginal land. It always has been, it always will be. And when you think about that, science saying Aboriginal people have been here for 60, 80,000 years, that's 3,000, 4,000 generations of people. When Europeans who've been on a farm for 5 or 6 generations feel a very special connection to that place, it's a remarkable thing to think about thousands of generations with the one piece of country. I want to acknowledge a few people, Elizabeth and Greg from the History Trust, Helen and Jason from Reconciliation SA, and Lenore, and I think Danielle's here somewhere from the Gladys Elphick Awards Committee. And I want to thank both Greg and Helen for their introduction. As they've said, I'm Kyam Maher. I'm the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, the Attorney General and Minister for Industrial Relations. And usually I'm not introduced correctly. When my order of precedence is written out, it is Minister for Aboriginal Affairs comes first, and just over a year ago when we had a state election, I had a couple of days running battle with the protocol people in government who insisted that I had to have Attorney General go first because that's more important. And it literally was a couple of days like, well, no, it's not. Aboriginal Affairs is why I'm in politics. That's more important, so that comes first. And I love walking to my office seeing Minister for Aboriginal Affairs and then Attorney General under it. I think it annoys a lot of the lawyers though. Tonight we gather here to celebrate the legacy and spirit of Gladys Elphick, a remarkable Aboriginal activist whose name resonates with courage, determination and passion. Gladys was not just a trailblazer, she was a force of nature driving forward the advancement for her people and the fight for Indigenous rights. Gladys Elphick's life was testament to the resilience and unwavering commitment that so many Aboriginal people exhibit. She embarked on a remarkable journey as an advocate for Aboriginal rights, dedicated herself to uplifting her Aboriginal people. Amongst her many achievements, Gladys played a pivotal role in establishing the Council for Aboriginal Women in South Australia, and through her leadership, she addressed the specific challenges faced by Aboriginal women and their family, championing causes in particular such as education, healthcare and housing. But Gladys's contribution extended far beyond the confines of these organisations. She fought tirelessly for the right to vote for Indigenous Australians, leaving her mark on history in this way. In the 1960s, she stood tall as an influential figure in the 1967 federal referendum, a pivotal moment in our history last century. Her dedication and belief in equality propelled the struggle for Aboriginal rights forward. Gladys Elphick's activism was a tapestry interwoven with cultural pride, language and traditions. As a respected elder, and noting the theme of this year's NAIDOC Week, she worked tirelessly to preserve and promote the rich heritage of her people and understood that cultural resilience was a cornerstone of empowerment. Throughout her remarkable life, Gladys faced countless challenges and barriers. She confronted discrimination, prejudice, systematic injustices that disproportionately still affect Aboriginal people today. But she refused to be silenced. She raised her voice and, using her platform, shone a light on these injustices and a fight for meaningful change. She inspired others to join the struggle, igniting a fire of activism that continues to burn brightly today. For the gains that have been made today and that we seek to make in the future owe a great deal to the activists of the past, and none burns more brightly than Gladys Elphick. The title of the oration this year is South Australia's Democratic Leadership, the voice in our history. And today, we stand at a crucial juncture in time, a crossroads for this nation. We have an opportunity to define who we are, how we deal with our past, and the type of future that we want. The history of our nation's conflicts and steps towards resolution between non-Aboriginal and Aboriginal Australians have had many milestones. We have, in the decades and centuries gone by, seen some of the worst in individuals, institutions and governments. We've seen policies designed and enforced to marginalise and harm and attempt to destroy the oldest living culture that is alive on this planet. In little more than 230 years, we've seen dramatic change. However, Australia has not yet come to terms with its true past, and the impact that this past continues to have on Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people today is very real. And it's important that we shine a light on the most difficult parts of our history, which are often ignored or covered up. And this is important, as our values, attitudes and actions as a society have their roots in our history. We must know and accept the truth so that we know how to live in the present and shape our future. This notion of truth-telling is one of the central tenets reflected in the Uluru Statement from the Heart, along with voice and treaty. And I'm proud that our state government is committed to the implementation of all three of those tenets in South Australia. In the decades and centuries that have gone by, the laws of our state and the colony that preceded it have done much to disadvantage, discriminate and disempower against Aboriginal people. Whether through occasional well-intentioned ignorance or sometimes deliberate cruelty, the practice of excluding Aboriginal people from the decisions that affect them has, at the very best reading of it in our history, stood in the way of progress. At worst, it's been used as a tool of oppression and brutality, enshrining intentionally harmful policies in law, destroying families, communities and culture. In recent times, efforts have been made to undertake reconciliation with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples, and address the policies that have affected them by conservative governments and institutions. And I'm proud that in much more recent times, South Australia has led the way in these reforms and legislation. I want to take a little bit of time this evening to talk about the legacy in Aboriginal affairs of one particular government reformer who I know has a very special place in the hearts and the lives of many Aboriginal people, including Gladys Elphick. Former Premier Don Dunstan is remembered for many enormous achievements throughout his career, but in particular, Don's achievements in Aboriginal affairs, I think, helped not just the Labor Party, but South Australia turn a corner and set a course for a better future. Just 3 years after a very young Don Dunstan was elected to the South Australian Parliament, he was invited to the Point Pearce Aboriginal community on the York Peninsula and witnessed the disempowerment of the local community members. He'd later credit this visit for sparking his passion in supporting Aboriginal communities. Throughout his career, he would successfully accomplish extraordinary things with and for Aboriginal South Australians. From things such as successfully passing amendments to the Police Offences Act, which at the time criminalised consorting between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people, to establishing groundbreaking reforms like the establishment of the Aboriginal Lands Trust, the first major Aboriginal land rights legislation anywhere in Australia in 1966. After Don listened to the voices of people who were living in South Australia, people like Charlie Perkins, John Moriarty, and of course Gladys Elphick, it was Dunstan, who was Minister for Aboriginal Affairs and Attorney General at the time, drove this idea that Aboriginal people should hold the rights to their land, with the Aboriginal Lands Trust today holding over 500,000 hectares of land across the state on trust for Aboriginal people. Don Dunstan tackled discrimination in law and in policy. He supported the teaching of the Pitjantjatjara language for teachers and appointed Sir Doug Nicholls as our first and still only Aboriginal governor. Dunstan continued to advocate for Aboriginal rights at the highest levels and became the third president of the Federal Council for Aboriginal Advancement. Even at this time and holding this position, he became committed to ensuring that Aboriginal people were at the table of discussing matters that affected their lives. This was epitomised when he was the president of the Federal Council for Aboriginal Advancement, and he had a determination that he'd be the last non-Aboriginal person ever elected to that position. And he was successful in his endeavour when Joe McGuinness was elected as an Aboriginal person as president in 1961. Former Liberal Premier David Tonkin's Liberal government enacted the Unangu Pitjantjatjara Land Rights Act, now the Unangu Pitjantjatjara Yunkanjatjara Land Rights Act in 1981, after much of the groundwork, much of the committee work, much of the draft of the legislation had been done under the government that Don Dunstan led before that election. And this was followed by the Maralinga-Jarrattara Land Rights Act in 1984. Don Dunstan's example shows us that South Australian governments, and I'm proud to say South Australian Labor governments, can lead the way in the nation, can shine a light for a better future in Aboriginal affairs. And we should remember that as we consider how our country can best meet the moment we face in our shared history today. Much of Don Dunstan's legacy has been built upon both by Liberal and Labor administrations in South Australia. In May of 1997, then Liberal Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, Dean Brown, apologised to the Stolen Generations only 2 days after handing them down of the Bring Them Home report. Many years later, albeit a very significant step was taken with the national apology from Prime Minister Kevin Rudd on the 13th of February 2008. In a South Australian context, and as Minister for Aboriginal Affairs in our previous government when Jay Weatherill was Premier, we established a reparation fund for survivors of the Stolen Generations. It was introduced in 2015 and stemmed from the recommendations of the Bring Them Home report. South Australia became the first mainland state to implement such a scheme for survivors of the Stolen Generations, recognising that saying sorry, providing reparations can never undo the harm of the past. It was an important step that we made on our journey in South Australian reconciliation. In 2016, South Australia became the first place in the country to embark upon a process of treaty with Aboriginal people. And much like the feeling we have at the moment, in 2016 and 2017, it felt like we were on a huge precipice of change. Like at other times in our history, the leadership of South Australia has a chance of being matched federally. In South Australia in 2018, we signed the very first agreement in a treaty process anywhere in the country. The Brother Agreement between the state of South Australia and the Narungga Nation was a landmark document with the government supporting areas of economic development, social services and community wellbeing. Importantly, that document and the processes set in train marked an increase in cooperation and collaboration between an Aboriginal community and the state government. It provided for projects like facilities on Mordang Island off Point Pearce and promised further collaboration. There's some wonderful synchronicity that the very place that gave birth to Don Dunstan and sparked the fire in his belly for Aboriginal affairs was also the place that was the signing of the first, that was the nation with whom the South Australian government at the same time signed the first agreement as part of a treaty process. So South Australia has played a very significant and very leading role throughout our history, from the activism of Gladys Elphick, the leadership of Don Dunstan, to what we've done over the last decade or so. And that sort of leads us to where we are today. Many will remember in May of 2017, delegates from right across the country met at Uluru and handed down the Uluru Statement from the Heart, one of the most concise and beautiful pieces of writing I think this country's ever produced. It was a remarkable, generous invitation from First Nations people to the rest of Australia to come together, make real change and build a better future. Only a couple of months after May of 2017, when the Uluru Statement was handed down, the annual Garma Festival was held in northeast Arnhem Land. And I can remember being there at the time, giving a talk about the treaty process we were embarking upon in South Australia, and you could almost cut the optimism with a knife. You could feel a sense of change. The Uluru Statement had just been handed down. Aboriginal Australia had been asked, what are the next steps forward? And Aboriginal Australia had given the answer: voice treaty truth. I can only imagine that sort of sense of optimism and a change for the better must have been a little bit of what it was like in the lead up to the 1967 referendum. But so soon after that Uluru Statement, after the Garma Festival, the then federal government of the day decided they wouldn't do that. Having been given that generous invitation, the blueprint of the next steps forward, decided not to go ahead with anything. To his credit today, then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, who opposed a voice to Parliament, claiming it would be a third chamber, is now one of the most ferocious supporters of it. I just wish he would have been back then. It might have been a very, very different world we live in if that had been the case and had seen bipartisan support for the endeavour we're now embarking upon. And that denial of what was set out at the Uluru Statement from the Heart by the then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, I think was devastating and held us back at least half a decade in making changes. I can remember spending time with then opposition leader Bill Shorten, explaining the importance of Labor federally committing to the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and I was very pleased that that was the case. That's what, in the lead up to the 2019 federal election, we did. But then being devastated with the loss of the election. I can remember distinctly being in my ute at the Port Noarlunga Footy Oval, where one of my kids was playing football, ringing my good friend Senator Pat Dodson, lamenting about the opportunity lost for this nation. And it was only a couple of weeks after that 2019 federal election, just before NAIDOC Week 2019, I was sitting down with then opposition leader Peter Malinauskas, talking about the same sort of thing, the fact that there wasn't a government who would implement at a federal level the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And we decided then, in NAIDOC Week of 2019, our very first election policy from the opposition would be, if we won, we will implement this at a state level. We couldn't wait for a change of government, Liberal or Labor, to implement it federally. And I can distinctly remember the Saturday night of the March state election last year, when Premier-elect Peter Malinauskas got up, and the very first thing he talked about was an Aboriginal affairs policy. I've never heard that before. And I've heard it once since, after the federal election, with newly Prime Minister-elect Anthony Albanese got up. And the very first thing that he talked about was an Aboriginal affairs policy. We have seen remarkable recent change. And I can remember very soon after that state election last year, when we won the state election, being exceptionally buoyed and then thinking, oh, now we've got to do it. And that's what we did. We embarked on a huge consultation. Commissioner Dale Aegis, First Nations Voice Commissioner, spent many, many months last year going right across South Australia, from Sejuna up to the APY lands, Cooper Pedy, Unadada, Port Lincoln, down to Mount Gambier, and all points in between, consulting with Aboriginal South Australians, Aboriginal communities and Aboriginal organisations about what does a voice mean and how it would look in South Australia, and came back with a whole series of ideas that we transcribed as best we could and had drafted legislation model. Then Dale went back out again and said, we got those white lawyers in Adelaide to come up with this. How does it look? Is this how you think a voice should look? And eventually, in another historic first for South Australian democracy, on 11 a.m. on a wet, cold March morning, on the 26th of March, we passed that legislation to create the nation's first ever Aboriginal voice to a parliament. Again, standing on the shoulders of those who've come before, Gladys Elphick, Don Dunstan, and so many others. And our voice, much like what's being proposed federally, is empowered not to just speak to the parliament, not just to speak on issues of policy once the decisions have been made and there's legislation before parliament, but it's empowered and has a legislative right to speak to executive government. Our South Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice to Parliament has an ability once a year to address a joint sitting of both houses of Parliament. It has a legislated right to speak to the Parliament on any single bill that's put before the Parliament. And not just speak to the Parliament, but speak in the Parliament. The voice, a representative voice, has a right to speak on the floor of Parliament on any bit of legislation that comes before our Parliament. Our voice in South Australia has an ability to take part in cabinet meetings at least twice a year, to have a meeting with all the chief executives together of government departments at least twice a year, and to have one day a year where representatives of our Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander voice get to choose which ministers, which chief executives, they want to grill, ask about what they're doing in terms of policy and spending for Aboriginal people. This is an example of a nation-leading policy, and I think one that can shine the way for the rest of Australia. And when you look at the advances that we've made, you've got to look just to 1966, 1 year before the 1967 referendum. The Australian government was precluded from making laws concerning Aboriginal people. The second component of that 67 referendum sought to have Aboriginal people counted when the population was counted. Can you imagine that, not counting Aboriginal people as part of the population of Australia? Prior to that, Aboriginal people were not figured as part of census counts. They were excluded from population figures and were, on the whole, statistically undocumented. This made it impossible to understand or to cater for the needs of Aboriginal people when governments do planning in health, education, housing, or indeed in any capacity at all. More than that, though, more than the problems with developing policies when you don't have statistical basis to do so, it was indicative of an attitude that most Europeans held at settlement, an attitude which persisted for way too long in the laws of our country. Basically, Aboriginal people weren't counted because Aboriginal people didn't count. That 1967 referendum reflected the early beginning of a shift in the nation's thinking, a line in the sand. Increasingly, people began to understand that Aboriginal people ought to matter and ought to be counted. The referendum wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It had practical implications and applications. But the symbolism, nonetheless, was important, and it still is. It was important because it was part of the beginning of something that's still ongoing today. A beginning of what might have seemed at the time a radical notion, that Aboriginal people are people like everyone else, that they ought to be visible, not invisible, that they ought to matter. I think the 67 referendum paved the way, both legislatively and ideologically, for a great deal of change to occur. It's important to understand that just about every right that Aboriginal people have gained in this nation has been won, not granted. And again, we think back to your Gladys Elphicks, your Don Dunstans. The 67 referendum's resounding yes result came about in part because of the tireless advocacy undertaken by Aboriginal activists, including many of our own South Australians. Many, like but not limited to Gladys Elphick, Maud Tongaree, Louisa O'Donoghue, Faith Thomas, Ruby Hammond, Natasha McNamara, Winnie Branson, Vince Copley, Charles Perkins, Shirley Paisley and Gordon Briscoe. It was a poignant moment for those who played their part, granting determination, with their determination granting dignity for Aboriginal people. But it wasn't the end of the struggle. It still wasn't until 1992 that our court system recognised that there were people here before colonisation, with the overturning of the fiction of terra nullius with the Mabo court case. And now we find ourselves right on the doorstep of another federal referendum where Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders are central once again. A referendum to be held later this year, in October or November, which seeks to elevate the voices of Aboriginal people right across the country. And we must be under no misconceptions. A successful referendum is not an easy feat. As you all know, it requires a double majority. A majority across Australia and a majority in a majority of states. There have been 44 questions put to the Australian population at referendum since Federation 1901. 8 of the 44 have been successful. It doesn't happen very often. We have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make a change for the positive. A once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Constitution as the first peoples of this continent, or a choice to continue to dismiss the important place they play in our nation's history. We have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to listen to our most vulnerable and afflicted community members through a recognised and enshrined voice at the highest levels of Parliament and government. Or we can continue to turn our heads to their invitation to be acknowledged and heard. We have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity not only to show ourselves, but people across the world, that we place a value on the oldest living culture on the planet. I speak in these binary terms, the choice, the stark choice we face, because I think it's important to draw attention to the reality of the status quo and what this represents for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Can you imagine trying to explain this to someone not from Australia, why we voted no? I was talking recently to some Maori friends from New Zealand, and can you imagine the day after a referendum, if it fails, trying to explain, having people ask, well, was it because this body could veto government policy? Well, no, it was an advisory body. Was it because this body could decide on government spending on all sorts of... Well, no, it was an advisory body. So it was an advisory body, and Australia voted against that? Can you imagine trying to explain why Australia would vote against a simple proposition of allowing Aboriginal people to have more of a say in the decisions that affect their lives? That's what we're asking. It really is as simple as that. Having worked most of my life in Aboriginal affairs and that intersection of politics, I am sure of, and the evidence shows, that governments do better. There are better policies and better services for Aboriginal people if Aboriginal people have a say in those things. No change is easy. 8 out of 44 referendum questions succeeding. It's a campaign that won't be easy, but I think it's a campaign that's critically important. As I've said, imagine trying to explain what sort of country we are if it's a no vote. Ken Wyatt, the former Liberal Minister for Aboriginal Affairs federally, has talked about the fact of, others will see us as a racist country. That very simple notion of an advisory body to government being voted down is almost unthinkable. But that's not going to happen. I am optimistic and I am confident about this referendum. I think it will show the rest of, I think it will be a defining moment for Australia. It will define how we see ourselves and, importantly, how others see us. I know that between now and a referendum coming up in October or November, many of you here are going to be doing a lot of hard work, a lot of talking in your communities, a lot of one-on-one conversations, telling people what this voice is, why it's important, but also, importantly, what it isn't, and what some of the misconceptions. And I leave you with an invitation. Imagine waking up on the Sunday after the referendum. It's a successful yes vote. Think of the sort of country we have become, and what that says about us. Thank you for having me here tonight. Thanks, Greg.
Thank you, Kyam. Now, we have a couple of microphones to rove around, and you very generously agreed to respond to a few questions. So I'm going to play Phil Donahue and point, and please, when you have the microphone, please stand up so that the Minister can see you, and ask your question or put your proposition. Okay, who's first? Gentleman over here.
I have a simple question about the process. Will there be two separate questions on the referendum that will be handled differently or counted separately, or is it really one item?
No, that's a really good question. I'm very pleased that I'm able to answer that. It'll be one question. And I haven't got the exact text in front of me, but it's very close to something like, do you support recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians through a voice enshrined in the Constitution? Yes or no? And there'll be a box next to that one question, and you handwrite in either yes or you handwrite in no. It'll be as simple as that.
I'm Claudia Cream. I just wonder whether that question will be in different languages, for the multicultural communities, because some of them may not be understanding, the English so much, yes.
Yeah, another good technical question. Yeah. As I understand it, the question on the ballot paper will be in English, but I know that there will be, in the lead up, a lot of work that's done in our multicultural communities in languages, and also, I suspect, on the day as people go to vote, information in language. Not just multicultural languages, but our own languages, the Pinjara and Yunkanjara and other languages that will be important. And the way that referendums are set up, where you have to actually write in the word yes or no, has been something of a concern, because for many Australians, including Aboriginal Australians, English is not a first language, and to have to write in a yes or a no is something that there has been some debate about, but that is what is required for referendums.
Thank you very much for your very optimistic note. I share that. I was just wondering, in my deliberations of talking to people who are wondering what they're going to vote, when I ask them, what will you lose if you vote yes? And I wonder if that's a way to help people to understand that 97% of us won't lose anything. But just like with the sorry, it is a huge step forward to gain so much. So I was just wondering, is that a useful handle in your thinking?
Absolutely. And every single day I will be somewhere, walking on the street to get my lunch, or a shopping centre, or knocking on doors, campaigning, and I will be asked by someone about the voice, and often people who don't understand, haven't heard much about it, and are inclined to vote no, because why would you change about something that don't properly understand? And it's usually about 90 seconds worth of talking, when 99% of the time the person's like, oh, well, why wouldn't you vote for that? And one of the things that is often exceptionally convincing is that no one's put any evidence anywhere that anyone loses a single thing, because no one does. There is no one who has power taken away from them. There's no one who is worse off, but governments will do better by having Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's voices elevated and being involved in the decision-making process. And why, if you're designing programs for Aboriginal people, why wouldn't you want them involved in the decision-making process? It is simple as that. Yeah, so no one loses, and not just Aboriginal people have a lot to gain. I think this whole country is elevated by a yes vote. No one loses and we all gain.
Thank you, Minister. Just wondering if you could give us a sense of what our country will look like post-referendum with a yes vote. What will we look like?
So, South Australia, when we have our inaugural elections for our Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander voice in March next year, and Australia sometime after that as a yes vote, will be a country that has said that we value Aboriginal people. We recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, the oldest living culture on the planet, in our constitution, in the what many consider the birth certificate of a modern nation, recognising the oldest living culture the planet has seen. But more than that, we say we value the voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We want to listen to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on the decisions that affect their lives. As I said, I think it is a defining and uplifting moment for our country. I think it'll be a sunnier, better day after the referendum.
Minister, I've been...
name, please.
Max
Thanks,
Anderson.
Max.
Minister, I've been shocked by the vociferousness of the stealth campaign going on by the Murdoch press in particular, Sky News in particular. And I was wondering whether you get a sense of what it is they're most frightened of, or they're most confronted by.
The short answer is I'm not quite sure. I don't properly understand that, but a more exciting answer is change. Just scared and frightened of change. And it is going to be a difficult campaign. It already has been. It will be difficult for many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the lead up to the referendum. But that is not a reason not to want to make change. In fact, it's more of a reason to make change. Can you imagine telling Rosa Parks in the US or Charlie Perkins here in Australia, don't get on those buses because it will cause problems and it will be difficult? No, you wouldn't do that. Change is often difficult. The fights that were fought and the battles that were won by Gladys Elphick, by Don Dunstan and others have made us a better place and a better society. It is unfortunately often a necessary element to confront some of the worst inhumanity that comes out during these sorts of debates. But no, it is difficult to understand the opposition to an advisory body. It really, that no one has anything lost from it. It is actually exceptionally difficult. Scared of change.
Lainey, Max Anderson's wife, Murdoch journalist. I've asked friends to ask me, what what their concerns are. And two of the big ones that come back are that it will cause division, and a yes vote will cause division, and also, well, start with that one. I know my own answer to that, but what is an easy answer that you would give to those who say a yes vote will cause division in Australia?
And it's a good question, and I've done quite a number of these forums, and I expect we'll be doing a lot more over the next few months. We already have division in places in Australia, in our society. This will help heal some of the divisions. I think it has exactly the opposite effect.
Sorry, the other one was that I'm concerned and I'm confused because some Aboriginal members of Parliament federally don't want a yes vote, and that confuses me and makes me think maybe I should vote no as well.
Yeah, and again, that is a question that is often put, and the way I usually answer that is you're absolutely right. There are some Aboriginal members of Parliament and some members of the Aboriginal community who don't wish for this. It's about 85% on most surveys of Aboriginal people who do want this, but Aboriginal people aren't one homogenous group where they agree on everything. And that's the whole point of having a voice, to represent the diversity of Aboriginal views in our community. What we've set up in South Australia is a directly elected series of 6 local voices that will represent the diversity of views in different areas of South Australia that then come together to form a statewide voice. And it's exactly and precisely that diversity that the voice seeks to have represented to Parliament. So there are some people in the community, there are some Aboriginal people in the community, although a minority, who for various reasons don't wish for this, but Aboriginal people are just like any other group. It's not one common homogenous view. But it is important, I think, to recognise that, certainly it's my experience, and that's reflected in, even in polls that move around, that somewhere north of 80% of Aboriginal people are supportive of the model that's put forward.
I quote Uncle Mookie, "We need your voice to get our voice."
I'd just like to repeat some of the stupid things I've heard and seen on media, multimedia in particular. Parking fines are going to go up if we vote yes. Did you know that?
What's that?
Parking fines are going to go up because we have to pay a certain amount to the Aborigines. Aborigines are going to come and take over my front lawn, etc., etc. They're just ludicrous Trumpisms. How can we pour water on these stupid ideas that are being put around in social media?
So in the early 1990s, we heard some of the very same things we're hearing now. After the Mabo High Court case in 1992, and then the Keating era legislation that enshrined Mabo into our federal legal system, that everyone's suburban backyard was not safe, that Aboriginal people will have a right to that. It didn't happen then, and it won't happen now. This body is quite simply an advisory body. It'll give advice to government about things, but it will still be up to the government of the day to decide what to do. I think the advantage of this sort of body is, governments will have a moral need to explain if they're not abiding by the views of the voice, and I think that's good for decision making in Australia. But none of these things will come off. The other thing that's often raised is, government decisions will be off to the High Court. Every single decision they make will be challenged. I was fortunate to be in a group of about 40, I think it's called the South Australian Constitutional Lawyers Association, a group of, including our Solicitor General, judges and others. And one of the questions that was posed with this group of the 40 most preeminent South Australian constitutional legal minds was, what government decisions are most likely to be challenged as a result of the voice? and literally people thought for a little bit and really can't think of anything that is more susceptible or justiciable to a High Court challenge than anything a government already does now anyway. It is just not the case that this will result in those sorts of challenges that you hear from those who don't want change. Yeah, I agree, and at the moment, and that's going to be the task of all of us who are supporting this Yes campaign, is to make sure we're having those one-on-one conversations with people to make sure there's not that void of information that can be filled with things that just aren't true at all, and you just hear it on a little levels, things that aren't true that are so easy to verify. There on Port Lincoln ABC radio a couple of months ago, Tony Abbott was talking, and it was a thing that was repeated by Simon Birmingham, who should know better than this, recently, talking about what we've done in South Australia, saying it's very different than what's being proposed federally. And one of the points that both of those gentlemen made was that the South Australian voice isn't enshrined in our Constitution. It is. We changed our Constitution Act to directly reference the voice. It's a different process. It's an Act of Parliament, not a referendum. But our Constitution, the South Australian Constitution, was changed as part of the legislation that we put up to reflect the voice. There are so many things that are so easily proved wrong, but it is going to be a battle and a difficult one in the lead up to the referendum.
Thanks for your optimistic address. I have a question. Could you spend 90 seconds, please, with Warren Mundine and Jacinta Price so that you can turn them around? Because as Lainey alluded to, I think they might be the biggest obstacles to a yes vote. Yeah, that'd be 90 seconds too long. No, not being flippant. Yeah, it is disappointing to see people, and not necessarily Warren or Jacinta, but other people involved in this debate who I think do know better, but are taking a political route for own personal advancement, or thinking that's what they should be arguing. They are going to have their own views for their own reasons. It is disappointing, but it is what it is.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are almost at the conclusion of this evening's gathering, and before I offer a vote of thanks to Kyam, a shout out to the people who have made this evening's oration possible. A special thank you to Dane and Suze and Jazz and so many people at the History Trust team, to Danielle Dodd and from the Gladys Elphick Awards Committee, and to Jason Downs and Jessie Tilbrook from Reconciliation SA. Minister, thank you sincerely for a most thoughtful oration. All South Australians and others should have the opportunity to read or to watch your address. Your leadership and commitment to advancing the causes of inclusion, of recognition and of reconciliation will be remembered positively for posterity, and captured this evening on film for the benefit of all South Australians and others. This address will be produced and broadcast, a delayed broadcast on Channel 44, and later by free streaming from our website. So please keep an eye out on social media. Kyam, as a professional public servant, and I'm going to say Kyam because we've known each other for a quarter of a century, or just shy of that.
No, you wouldn't guess it.
You wouldn't guess it, no. I was once your age. As a professional public servant, it's not my place to publicly advocate on what has regrettably become a partisan issue. But as a friend to progress and to reconciliation, on behalf of our event partners and all of us here in attendance, and to all citizens who will participate in this referendum, I wish strength to your oar and on this historic mission. Thank you. And a small token of our appreciation. Thanks, Kyam. Yeah. Please thank the Minister.